Everybody, it's time for the Doldrums. I have a guest today. Let me show you. Oops, wait a minute. Where is she? Callie. Say hi, Callie. Okay, Callie's going to listen to the story today. So we're at the Doldrums. We're on the Doldrums. And we are on Chapter 13. The weeks passed from one to the next, and it was nearing the end of September. Archer had spent a considerable amount of time trying to work out the specifics of how they would actually pull this journey off. There were two issues. They needed both a departure date for a ship going to Antarctica and equipment. He knew the ship would have almost everything they needed, but thought it best to have a few things of their own just in case something went wrong, as it had for his grandparents. The problem was that this would require a trip into Rosewood, a trip that would be more difficult than sneaking out of the button factory or into Oliver's house. But Archer had an idea. He asked Oliver and Adelaide to meet him on the rooftop early one Saturday morning. Oliver struggled up the ladder with a bowl of oranges and 3 plates. Adelaide spread a cloth over the table and opened a brown paper bag. "What are those?" Oliver asked. "Chocolate croissants. You'll like them." The two had been bringing provisions to the roof for quite some time. "Is that everything?" Adelaide asked. It was everything. Chocolate croissants, tea and oranges, toast with butter and toast with jam, 3 soft-boiled eggs, undercooked bacon, some leftover birthday cake, and a little espresso. Oliver and Adelaide were both quite proud of this spread until Archer jumped over the crack between the house with a cooler and a disapproving frown. "Is something wrong?" Adelaide asked. Archer lowered the cooler. "What's all this food here?" he asked. "You said you wanted to have a nice breakfast while you explain the next step." Archer shook his head. There had been a misunderstanding. He thought they should try eating an ice breakfast, but there was a noticeable drop in morale after he said this. Oliver looked especially disappointed. He just spent the hour, under Adelaide's instruction, trudging up and down 4 flights of stairs with all the food. "Ice breakfast," Oliver repeated, glancing over the delicious table. Archer nodded, but he was now thinking the same thing Oliver was. "This does look much better," Archer admitted, pushing the cooler under the table. "We can eat the ice later." Oliver and Adelaide were relieved. They all sat down to feast, and for a while did so in silence. It was still early morning, and most of the city was asleep, but the sun was beginning to rise, and the trio was glowing a brilliant orange. Adelaide poured her tea into a bowl and drank. Oliver lowered his croissant. "You're doing it wrong," he said. "Why are you drinking from a bowl?" "This is how we do it in France," she replied. Oliver grinned and held out a spoon. "Would you like this as well?" Adelaide bounced an orange peel off his forehead and into his cup. Oliver used the spoon to fish it out. Archer finished his croissant and brushed the flakes from his fingers. "Adelaide is the only one who's ever been to Rosewood Port," he said. "Do you think you can get us inside?" Adelaide stirred her tea and nodded. "We're small enough," she said. "I doubt the guards would even notice." Oliver's cheeks bulged with croissant. "But if you do get inside," he said, "then what are you going to do?" "We'll have to find a ship to stow away on," said Archer. Somehow he would have to figure out if and when a ship was leaving for Antarctica, and they could board that ship while the cargo was being loaded. Rosewood Port was a large and heavily trafficked, with ships docking and departing every day. "There must be at least one heading to Antarctica in the near future," said Archer. "But if not," said Adelaide, "we can always take any ship as long as it goes south. Then change at another port to another ship that would go even farther south to Antarctica." Archer agreed and took out his notebook. He flipped through the pages. "But how are you going to know when a ship is leaving?" Oliver asked. Adelaide studied him. "Why do you keep saying you?" she asked. "Don't you mean we?" Archer wasn't paying attention. His first concern was finding equipment. The night before, he'd rummaged through the map room looking for anything that might help him. Mostly he'd found dust. But he also stumbled onto a box with cards inside it. Each card listed the name, address, and account number of various shops around Rosewood. Some were very strange, but Archer found one that he thought was important. He slipped the card out of his notebook and handed it to Adelaide. "I found this last night," he said. "I'm sure you've been to stores like this before." "I haven't, but I think we can find what we need in there, right?" And the store was called Strait of Magellan. "This should be good," said Adelaide, still wondering what she had gotten herself into. You want to go and have a look? Yes, said Archer, and we can ask them about docking schedules at Rosewood Port. I'll bet they'll know something. This was the first step of Archer's plan. Overall, it wasn't a very good plan, but it's better to have not a very good plan than no plan at all. Oliver disagreed. Oliver had made a decision the night of the firefly hunt, but still had not said anything to Archer. His window of opportunity was quickly closing, so he decided that now was the time. He pulled a newspaper clipping from his pocket, flattened it against his leg, and handed it to Archer. I've liked spending time with you both, he said, but I have to stop at the water's edge. I'm not going to Antarctica. And this will explain why. Said the Doldrums Press. Cream of tomato soup. Family stunned when lion-hearted Uncle Baxley was found face first in his cream of tomato soup at the age of 43. Archer wasn't surprised. With a healthy diet and ample exercise, a lion's heart can last up to 15 years. Mr. Baxley's made it to 43. That's not the point, said Oliver. What's the point? Adelaide asked. The point, said Oliver, is that some people's hearts can handle more than others. A year with Mrs. Merkley is plenty for me. I can't handle much more, and I don't want to die in a bowl of cream of tomato soup. But you don't eat cream of tomato soup, said Archer. I don't like it much either, said Adelaide. The kind of soup doesn't matter, said Oliver. I don't want to die in any kind of soup or on an iceberg in Antarctica. I can't handle that. And to be honest, you shouldn't be doing this either. He turned to Adelaide. Did he tell you what will happen when his plan fails? If the plan fails, said Archer. What will happen? Adelaide asked. Archer was silent. His mother will ship him off to Ravenwood, said Oliver. Ravenwood, she repeated. Yes, said Oliver. Mrs. Merkley used to teach there. It's a boarding school. I knew a boy who was sent there. And, said Adelaide. Well, I don't know, said Oliver. He never said very much about it when he returned. He never said much of anything, really. He just sort of sat there, humming, like an electric fan. Is that true? Adelaide asked Archer. I don't know, said Archer, but we're not going to fail. And I don't understand why you've waited till now to say this. Because I never thought I'd actually have to do anything, said Oliver. But it's all becoming much too real for me. I was only in this for friendship. Adelaide fiddled with an orange. It wasn't her original intention, but the more time she spent with these two, the more she liked them. I'm here for friendship too, she said. Then we all agree, said Archer. And who said anything about dying? I don't plan on dying. Nobody plans on dying, said Oliver. I nearly died, said Adelaide. That's why you're not afraid, Oliver replied. I've only had far-death experiences, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. But that's not going to happen, said Archer. Don't you see? My grandparents did great things together, and I think we can too, beginning with finding them. This is your chance to become more than just a glub. I like being just a glub, said Oliver. You two are the ones who like to court danger and swim with crocodiles and things like that. Me? I prefer to catch fireflies and see how many blueberries I can fit into my mouth. No one ever died from eating a blueberry. I'm sure someone did, said Adelaide. But this is all happening for a reason, said Archer. Nothing happens for a reason, said Oliver. Everywhere is chaos. Adelaide was half eaten by a crocodile, your grandparents are stuck to the side of an iceberg, and my cat turned into a statue. Archer and Adelaide exchanged glances, and Oliver shrugged. Theo, he said, he ate cement mix. I don't want to talk about it. What I'm trying to say is that I see this stuff every day in my father's newspaper, and there's no rhyme or reason to any of it. Terrible things just happen, and you'd better get out of the way when they do. You can't always get out of the way, said Adelaide. You need friends to pull you out of the way, said Archer. Oliver stared at him. He couldn't argue with that. But you're doing the opposite of pulling me out of the way. That's not true, said Archer. If you don't come with us, you'll be alone with Mrs. Merkley. Oliver turned to Adelaide, who shrugged and popped an orange slice into her mouth. You have a choice, she said. That's not a choice, said Oliver. A choice is deciding whether to eat cake or ice. So choose cake, said Adelaide. Archer nodded. Choose friendship. The table fell silent. Oliver pushed his plate forward and begrudgingly searched his pockets until he found the ad for survival kits that he'd torn from the Deep Sea magazine. Can I see that card? He asked Adelaide. She gave it to him. It was the same shop. Oliver nodded and handed the card back to Archer. All right, he said, but before I go anywhere, I need you both to promise me something. Avec plaisir, said Adelaide. That means with pleasure. Oliver didn't want a French lesson, so he continued speaking slowly. If we find ourselves stuck to the side of an iceberg, and I'm too cold to think, I need you to whisper in my ear the word dig. I promise to say dig, said Adelaide, even though she thought this a strange request. Archer nodded. The sun was now a little higher in the sky. All three stared out across the rooftops in the direction of the ocean, much like Alexander the Great, sitting atop his elephant, staring up at the Himalayas. So now what? Adelaide asked. Archer held up his card. But it's Saturday, said Oliver. Archer smiled. He knew exactly what day it was. Archer went to the edge of the roof and looked down into the gardens. Oliver and Adelaide joined him and popped orange slices into their mouths. It's the Autumn Flower Festival, said Archer. Down below, all of the neighbors were busy making preparations for a day of garden tours, cider and cakes, and music. The Durnaps garden swelled with magnificent orange dahlia flowers, while Mr. Mallock showed his ruby hibiscuses to Mrs. Pemberton, who seemed much more impressed with her autumn roses. I don't think my father knows about this, said Adelaide. He'll be at the cafe all day. Not that it matters. Our flowers are dead. He didn't water anything. Mrs. Merkley's garden doesn't have any flowers, said Oliver. They probably made a run for it during the night. Archer and Adelaide laughed. Then the three of them looked at the Glubbs' infamous garden. Your mother never expects much from us, Archer, said Oliver, but I'm sure my mom will be hiding. Mrs. Glubb wouldn't be the only one hiding. Mr. Helmsley, who went into hiding during these events, Archer didn't have to. He had been 7 years old, the one and only time his mother had asked him to help her. Shortly after she'd handed him the clippers and sent him to the garden, he had discovered a new box from his grandparents and was in such a rush to open it that he accidentally trimmed the tips off his mother's most treasured flowers, the Gerberwallachs, a rare breed whose purple and red blooms can last 3 weeks unless you cut them off with clippers. After that, Mrs. Helmsley instructed him to stay far away from her flowers. She'll be busy all day, Archer mumbled, scanning the gardens for his mother. She must be down there somewhere. She was. Mrs. Helmsley was in the Leppertons' garden, helping to perk up a dreary pot of chrysanthemums. You've watered them too much, Archer heard her say. Mrs. Lepperton threw up her arms. When you smother them like this, something bad is bound to happen. This is our chance, said Archer. We have to go now. We'll head to Strait of Magdalene and see what we can find, and hopefully they'll know about ship schedules. If not, I'll figure something out. One by one, they climbed down the ladder to Oliver's room and dashed down the stairs, stopping on the third floor to grab a bus map. Mr. Glubb was sitting in the living room. He lowered his newspaper when the trio spilled into the foyer. Archer, Oliver, and Adelaide froze, their eyes fixed on Mr. Glubb. Mr. Glubb smiled and raised his paper once more. Still, no one moved. I didn't see anything, Mr. Glubb said from behind the paper. If anyone asks, I didn't see a thing. Archer looked at Adelaide, who looked at Oliver, who looked back at Archer, who shrugged and reached for the doorknob. They bent low as they passed beneath Archer's windows and the Leppertons' windows, and once they were in the clear, they took off down the sidewalk. Archer stopped after a few feet and spun around. Adelaide, who was only operating on one good leg, mind you, could never run as quickly as the others. He went back and took her hand. You'd think I'd be better with it by now, she said. You'll figure it out, he replied, and together they moved quickly down the sidewalk to join Oliver at the bus stop. How's your heart? Adelaide asked. Still beating, said Oliver. The end for today.